Hey everyone! In last week's video, Willie left a comment saying Jay Blanked created a firmware to allow FlipperZero to reach arbitrary URLs. The FlipperHTTP firmware runs on any ESP32 that's connected to your FlipperZero. You can then run a variety of apps that leverage this firmware. In this video, I'll show a demo of FlipSocial that allows you to post messages to other FlipSocial users. And then we'll look at FlipLibrary, which displays random facts and also lets you input a word to look up in a dictionary. I'll show you how to flash FlipperHTTP onto the Wi-Fi dev module. And then I'll show you how you can modify FlipLibrary to create new FlipperZero applications that access other information on the internet. Let's get started. In a couple minutes, I'll show you how to flash your Flipper Wi-Fi module. But first, we're going to go into Apps, and then GPIO, and then FlipperHTTP, and then FlipSocial. Here you can do post to add new posts. And I'll go ahead and type a post now. So if you're on Momentum firmware, again, the applications are under Apps, GPIO, FlipperHTTP. If you're on Roadmaster, the applications are under Apps, GPIO, ESP32. And if you're under Unleashed or Official, the applications will be under Apps GPIO. If the apps are not pre-installed, you may need to go to lab.flipper.net/apps and install them yourself. Also, the keyboard is different between Momentum and the other firmwares. Now we can go ahead and select the message we created and then click the right arrow to post your message. And there it is, our message was posted. You can also press the back button and then go to feed to see all of the flips that have been posted. And use the right arrow keys and left arrow keys to navigate the different flips. And Willie's been a huge help to me as well, so I flipped this message. Next, let's take a look at the FlipLibrary application. Go into Random Facts and Cat Fact. And there you go. There's an interesting cat fact. You can press back and then go down to dogs. And there's a dog fact for you. These facts are great for dinner conversation. And you can keep just pressing back and OK to get new facts. Next, let's take a look at dictionary. And here it says enter a word. And we can go ahead and type in a word. And then click save. You can see it says defining, and then here's the definition. And when you're setting it up, make sure you go down to Wi-Fi and set your SSID and password. On Momentum or Rogue Master, flashing is easy. Go into Apps, and then GPIO, and then ESP or ESP32, and then go down to ESP Flasher. Choose Quick Flash, Flipper Wi-Fi Dev Board, and then FlipperHTTP. My guess is Unleashed will have this option in the future as well. And if you're unofficial, Jay Blanked has the .bin files, and you can manually program your firmware using those 3 bin files. The process for programming manually is similar to the one we did last week when we did the Gemini firmware. So you'll just have to download those bin files onto your computer and then choose a manual and select the 3 files. 3 blinks means the firmware was successfully installed. So now you know a little bit about FlipSocial and FlipLibrary. I definitely encourage you to look through all the different applications. FlipLibrary is super interesting to me because it's an example of the Flipper making web API calls. There's lots of web pages out there that list various APIs that are available. This is just one of those lists. If we click into one of the topics like calendar, here's some of the calendar APIs that are available. This API talks about holidays for 90 countries. Click on Holiday API, API documentation, and then we can scroll down and there's a next public holidays. It takes a country code. So V3 next public holidays and then our country code. I'll go ahead and type in JP for Japan as the country code. And we can see here the request URL, and we can see the response that we get back from that API. In this video, I'll modify FlipLibrary to use this API, but I really want to encourage you to think about other APIs that might exist that we could use to make interesting Flipper applications. Even if you're not a developer, think about what kind of things would you like the Flipper to do now that it can connect to the internet. For example, we could listen on sub-gigahertz for a certain signal and then send a text message when we saw that signal. We'll look at a few API responses. This one returns your IP address, your country and country code, and even an estimated latitude and longitude. We could use this to show the weather, get current events near you, etc. In this video, I'll use that country code US, and we'll get the next public holidays in your region. This gives the date of the next holiday, along with the name of the next holiday. Next, let's look at a weather API, passing in that latitude and longitude. We ask for the temperature in Fahrenheit, and the value is 61 degrees. Here's a different weather API. This one has properties and then forecast, and we can take that value and then request that API. Our app could then show the detailed forecast. The Bible API is a good example of the fact that user information sometimes has to be encoded. So instead of John space 316, it's John %20 316. And some APIs require that you register with them, and they'll give you a key that you have to pass every time you make a call. If you use one of these APIs, you'll have to think of how your application is going to configure and store that key. Not every API returns JSON. For example, this API just returns text with a password hash and the frequency of that password. So I've modified FlipLibrary, and I've added an option for next holiday underneath dictionary. And when we go there, we see enter country code. And I'll go ahead and do JP. And hit save. And you can see it says finding holiday. And then it found our holiday, 2024 11/23. And there's the name of the holiday. Local name has characters that won't render on the Flipper 0, so we use the name property. Next, we have local holiday. And what this is going to do is it's going to find out what country code we're in, like US, and then it will go and make the request for that country code. So let's go ahead and try that. You can see the title says location, finding holiday, and then details. And now you can see the result was United States, and then the date and the holiday name. And that United States came from this country element, and then we use that country code to look up the result. Next, let's look at how you can modify FlipLibrary to make different web API calls. For this video, I'm using Momentum firmware. I've cloned it into Visual Studio Code, and we're under Applications, External, FlipLibrary, application.fam. And this video is based on version 1.3 of FlipLibrary. To debug FlipperHTTP apps, go to Settings and then System. And then for log device, make sure it's LPUART. If it's USART, switch it to LPUART. We don't want messages getting sent to our Wi-Fi module. Make sure your log level is set to debug. And then I turn on debug on, but this is kind of an optional step. The first file I modified is flipper_http.c. Our modification is in the FlipperHTTP load from file method. And right before the for loop, I added logging a debug message showing how many bytes we read from the file and the maximum bytes allowed to be read. This is helpful in determining how close your responses are to the maximum allowed size. Go ahead and save that, and the next file we'll look at is jsmn.c. We'll be adding a log message in getJSONValue. Our message is a debug message, and it will display the number of tokens we use to parse the object. When we make a web API call, we specify a max tokens, and this helps us understand how close we are to that maximum. In getJSONArrayValue, we log a similar debug message with the number of tokens for parsing an array. The next file we'll look at is flip_library.h. I'm defining two new submenu indexes, FlipLibrary submenu index holiday and FlipLibrary submenu index IP holiday for the IP address lookup. You should use whatever name makes sense for your API. And if you're making a new random fact, you would do something like FlipLibrary submenu index random facts birds. Next, we'll open flip_library_alloc.c. And I've added two items under dictionary. We're adding the item to submenu main. The label is next holiday, and then we specify the index we created in the previous file. If you made a random bird fact, you would use the submenu_random_facts, a label of birds, and the bird index you created in the previous file. And then the majority of our API code goes in the flip_library_callback.c file. Near the bottom of the file, there's a bunch of cases. We'll add a case for each of the indexes that we've defined. And then we'll call a function defined at the top of our file. And it's called FlipLibraryHoliday switch to view. And swap out the word holiday for whatever word makes sense for your API. Jumping up towards the top of the file, we can see the FlipLibraryCatFact switch to view. The title is random cat fact. This will display while the fact is loading. The function FlipLibraryCatFactFetch will be used to fetch the data. And then FlipLibraryCatFactParse will be used to parse the data. We'll be making one API call. And if the back button is pressed, we'll go back to random facts. We use FlipLibraryViewLoader since we can just load the cat fact and we don't need any user input. catfact.ninja/fact is just a GET request that returns a JSON response. That response has a property called fact, which contains a string with the fact. In our FlipLibraryCatFactFetch function, we call FlipperHTTP get request with headers, passing it the URL and the headers with application JSON. If our fetch was successful, it will call FlipLibraryCatFactParse, and the received response will be in fhttp.last_response. We call getJSONValue, passing it a key of fact, which matches that response property, passing it the data that we have, and specifying that we think the parser needs a maximum of 128 tokens. If this number is not big enough, you'll get an error, and if it's too big, you may run out of memory. The parse function will return the message, which will get displayed on the FlipperZero screen. Next, I'll open a terminal session to our FlipperZero, and then press L for logging. You could also go to lab.flipper.net/CLI. On my FlipperZero, I'll request a cat fact, and we can see that the parsed object had 5 tokens, so the 128 tokens was more than sufficient. Next, we'll look at FlipLibrary Dictionary switch to view. We call text input setHeaderText, passing the text input object and the message to display during input. And then like the cat, we call FlipLibrary generic switch to view. The title to display is defining. FlipLibrary Dictionary Fetch, FlipLibrary Dictionary Parse, one API call. For dictionary, we want the back button to go to the submenu instead of random facts. And then one more difference is we want to use FlipLibrary view text input query, which will prompt the user for input before calling our fetch. Once a user enters a word and clicks save, FlipLibrary dictionary fetch will get called. We'll create a payload variable for 128 bytes. And in our payload, we'll put word : and then the %s will get replaced with the text that the user entered. This API uses a post request instead of a GET request, so we use FlipperHTTP post request with headers. We pass the URL of our API. Our headers are content type application JSON, and then we pass the payload containing the word we're looking up. This API has two response types. The first is one that has a property of definition followed by the definition, and the second is --error followed by the error message. So in our FlipLibrary dictionary parse, we'll call getJSONValue, passing it a key of definition, our response object, and this time a max tokens of 16. If our definition is null, it means we didn't find the definition property. So we'll try getJSONValue, passing it that --error. So now you know how to handle get and post requests, you know how to prompt for user input, and you know how to parse multiple different responses. The next public holidays API poses some new challenges. The response returns an array of holidays, with each object having properties such as date, local name, and name. The Flipper0 doesn't have the font for local names, so we'll use the name property. Our JSON parser expects the array to be named, so our parser will modify the response, creating an object with the holidays property, and adding the close bracket for our object as well. Our FlipLibrary holiday switch to view will prompt the user to enter a country code, and then we'll display finding holidays using FlipLibrary holiday fetch and FlipLibrary holiday parse. FlipLibrary holiday fetch just returns FlipLibrary holiday fetch country code, passing in the country code the user specified. FlipLibrary holiday fetch country code takes a country code, and then we create a URL of 128 bytes, and we set that URL to our API, and then the %s will get replaced with the country code. Our API returns a result that's greater than 1K in size, so we need to store the result in a temporary file. At the top of the file, we define storage temp path prefix, which is storage ext path prefix, and then /.tmp. On the Flipper0 in QFlipper, you can see there's a .tmp folder, and it's used by lab.flipper.net and by us. Going back to that fetch country code, you can see we're setting fhttp.filepath, and the path we're copying in is that temp path, and then holiday.json. We call storage simply mkdir to make a directory if it doesn't already exist, and we pass in that temp directory. Next, we call storage simply remove recursive, and we pass in that file path to holiday.json. So if the file already exists, it will be deleted. We then use fhttp.saveReceivedData equals true, and this will make the next get or post request get saved to the file. And then we return Flipper HTTP GET request with headers, passing in that URL with our country code and our headers with our application JSON. Once the holiday is fetched, FlipLibrary holiday parse will get called. The last response variable only has the first K worth of response, so we'll use Flipper HTTP load from file, passing our holiday.json file name. This API currently returns responses up to 4K in size. At the beginning of our data string, we insert curly bracket holidays : and this API ends the response with a carriage return, 0x0d. If we don't find that carriage return, we'll just set term to the length of the string. And then we insert a close curly bracket at the location of term. Our data string should now look similar to the following JSON format. Next, we're logging a debug message with our data, but I found out debug messages also get truncated. If our debug message is at least 100 characters, we'll log a second debug message containing the end of our data. We call getJSONArrayValue, passing a key of holidays, an index of 0 to get the first holiday, and then our JSON data. It's hard to know how many tokens we need since the response size will vary by the country. In my testing, 512 seemed to work okay. We log an information message of the next holiday, and then if holiday is not null, we'll call getJSONValue, passing a key of date, passing in our holiday data, and 32 max tokens. Then we'll call getJSONValue, passing a key of name, our holiday, and 32 values. We'll log another information message, this time containing the date and the name. We'll allocate memory using malloc, and the size is the length of the date plus the length of the name, plus 3 more bytes for the colon, the space, and the null terminator. We set our result variable to date:name, and then we free the date, the name, and the holiday variables. And then we return that formatted result to display on the screen. We'll go ahead and open a terminal session to the Flipper. We'll do L for log. I'll choose next holiday, and for the country code, I'll type JP. We can see our holidays JSON was 323 tokens. Extracting the array was 321 tokens. And the first element in the array was 20 tokens. This means our estimate of 512 tokens and 32 tokens is sufficient. So you now know how to parse really large API responses, and you know how to manipulate that response so that you're able to parse it. We have one last example to look at, which is FlipLibrary IP holiday switched to view. We set our initial title to finding holiday parentheses location. Our fetcher is FlipLibrary IP holiday fetch, and our parser is FlipLibrary IP holiday parse. The main point of this example is we make 2 requests, the first for IP information and the second to look up the holiday. And this example doesn't use any user input, so we use FlipLibrary ViewLoader. The IPWhois API is just a GET request that returns back the country and the country code. FlipLibrary IP holiday fetch will actually be using the model. If we're on the first request, our request index will equal 0, and we'll return FlipperHTTP GET request with headers, passing in the URL for the IPWhois service, and our content type JSON headers. Once the data's been fetched, it'll call FlipLibrary IP holiday parse. We'll check if we're on the first request. If our model parser context has any objects, we'll free them. And then we'll set our model parser context to the result from getJSONValue, passing in a key of country, our last response, and a tokens of 64. We can then access this parser context in future calls to fetch or parse. Next, we call getJSONValue, passing a key of country code, our last response, and 64 tokens. We log an information message with the country and the country code. We then update our title to finding holiday details instead of finding holiday location. And then we return the country code, which will get set to our model's fact text. Since we specified a count of 2, FlipLibrary IP holiday fetch will get called again. And this time our request index will equal 1. We'll return FlipLibrary holiday fetch country code. And for the country code parameter, we'll pass in that fact text that came from our IP holiday parser. Once that country code holiday is fetched, it will call FlipLibrary IP holiday parse. And this time our request index should equal 1. And we'll call FlipLibrary holiday parse, passing in our model. The result should be a string containing the date and the name of the next holiday. If the holiday is not null, then we'll call malloc, passing in the length of our parser context, which is the name of the country, along with the length of the holiday, and then 2 more characters for a new line and the null terminator. Next, we'll set our result to the country name, a new line, and the holiday information. We'll free the holiday information and then we'll return the result. This probably would have been a good place to also free our model parser context and set it to null. We'll go ahead and connect to our FlipperZero. I'll do L to turn on logging, and then I'll choose local holiday on the FlipperZero. The first API printed our country and country code, and the second API returned United States, a new line, and then the date and name of the next holiday. Now you know how to use model request index, model parser context, and model fact text to combine requests. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you need any help making API calls, feel free to reach out to me on Discord. Please like and subscribe. And I'd love to hear your comments on the Flipper plus web APIs.